been a pretty slow summer for us so far. We've only been doing small projects and some finish work, and that's all been because this has been down all summer. But we are finally up and going, and that means that we have a lot to get done before winter. This week's goal is to clean up a bunch of the birch logs that we have laying around the outside of our clearing, from clearing for this building and clearing for our house and just clearing the driveway area. So we are going to get those all moved, get them milled up, and we're going to fill this solar kiln as full as we can so that we have fresh birch ready to go for our winter projects this year. So hidden away in the brush over here, we have quite a few logs to pull out. If we take a look up here, should be able to find a few of them right offhand. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's probably more hidden in here that I'm not seeing. And I've got a large pile of them back there too that we got to get cleaned up. So we're going to get all of these cut to 10-foot lengths, get them stacked up, and then we're going to get it on the mill. Easy part's done. They're all laid out so I can figure out exactly what I can use for the mill. I'll start with lopping off all the root balls and then knocking off branches on the ones that still have branches. And then from there we'll use our tape measure, and anything that's between 6 and 10 feet that is both big enough around and straight enough to mill will get cut out into sections. We'll get those pulled and stacked, and then the rest of it will get thrown in a pile for firewood in the future. A lot of the ones over here are pretty crooked and a little smaller, so I'm not sure how much we can get out of here. I'm hoping for maybe about half a dozen. The ones over on this side were actually quite a bit better. These two I'll definitely be able to get a couple good logs from. There's a few in this pile that I should be able to get a couple good ones. The 2 logs in here I should be able to get 2 a piece from at least, so these are pretty good ones to pull from. And then this pile are ones that I already had cut in the woods. I just drug them out, and I think most of these should be good for milling. Not this one, this will get thrown into firewood, and this small one of course. And then the last one is one laying there that I just uprooted not too long ago. Still needs all the limbs off and the root ball off, but I should be able to get at least one out of there. that mostly finishes up this pile. I've got to touch the ones with the root balls on them yet, because once I cut them, the root balls kind of tilted in on them, and I need to see if they're rotten on the end before I cut this end any further back. So I'll get the skid steer, I'll move the root balls out of the way so I can finish cutting those, and then I'll start getting all these stacked. Well, we got the first pile all cut up and cleaned up. I have just a couple piles of rounds from cutting and checking the logs. This pile here is all stuff that didn't make the cut. That's all going to be cut into firewood eventually, so just in our free time that'll get cut up. And we added about a dozen logs to our pile to get milled. So I'm not being too terribly picky with the logs to get milled. Basically, we're making sure that we are over at least 6 feet long, not too terribly wavy, and we don't want rot. So with the birch, they don't grow real straight like our spruce, so it's a lot more sorting through to be able to find logs to use. For example, this log is pretty wavy, so if I cut straight from the low point here, go through the middle and end up on the high point on that side, I'll be able to get a few 1-bys out of here, and then the cutoffs will just turn into firewood. So both these trees were cut down at the same time. This one should give me some pretty nice wood. It seems solid and nice, pretty straight. This one is being about the same size. Completely junk. I have this problem quite frequently with these live trees. If they've got a broken branch on the top, they get water in there and it starts rotting out that heartwood, and then it goes down the center of the entire tree and the whole tree is junk for me. Most of these trees up here, being up on a hill, get a lot of wind damage with the heavy snow on them. They break the tops and it just causes a lot of damage to these trees. And it's hard finding trees that are good for me to mill. This will get cut up though. I'll cut this one up every like 6 feet or so and see if I can find a spot where it stops rotting, but I don't have high hopes for it. tree kind of tricked me. My first cut was nice, not rotten at all here. And I measured out to my 10 feet, which would be here, and we have rot. So I took a chunk off, still rotten, and then started working my way back all the way to here. We still have rot, and on the other side you can see there's this split, and it's all rotten down that. So kind of wrecks this whole log. I worked my way up in sections at every tree branch joint, and once I got above this one, looks like we were nice. So I cut a section out, and I'll have a little log at the end there. There is a big Y here, which will cause me to have a pretty warpy spot in the board, so that'll have to be strapped down really tight in my kiln, along with right here. We'll add it to the pile to get milled, but it may be a lost cause. It's always disappointing to cut into your biggest, straightest logs to find this. I think the only ones that were good in this pile was this one, which is pretty straight. I got 2 logs out of it. And then this one here, but it's only good for about 6 feet before it starts going all over the place. Last 2 logs I have to check is this one on the root ball there, and the one behind it that has that big swoop in it. Both of these are pretty good size and pretty straight for the most part, so I'm really hoping they're good, but I'm not going to get my hopes up. I think I made it through the base of that one all the way, but I'm going to need the skid steer to move the root ball away to see if it's rotten. I had to go from both sides because it's longer than my bar in total. It felt really good cutting through it, so I don't know that there's any rot in there. It looks great. It's got this seam here that looks like is a really old heel, so a single crack, but it's not rotten at all, so this will give me a lot of good lumber. Well, this is what I get for being excited about the first cut. It progressively got worse down this crack. And it all leads up to right here. Old rotted out branch that rotted down the core. It just didn't quite make it all the way to the end. I think I'm going to still keep the first 2 because they're pretty big logs, and I think I'll be able to kind of work around those rotten spots because they're not too big. So I'll keep those 2, but the rest will be firewood. Well, I've got these 2 busted up. I went and took a look at the pile I have over here, and they all seemed pretty good except for 2. And then I had the 1 tree over there I took care of. It's getting pretty late, so I'm going to get these stacked up into their piles, and then we should be able to start milling. We are all gathered and stacked, and now I have a whole lot of milling ahead of me. So we're just going to be targeting all of the birch right now. There is some spruce over here and quite a bit here. We're not going to worry about that for the moment. And the first thing we're going to tackle is all the full 10-foot length ones. So any short ones like this that I come across, I'm going to pull out and set aside. And that's just because when we're stacking in our solar kiln, I want all of the long boards first, and then we'll pyramid up to the shortest ones. That being said, I already cleared out all of the shorter boards that I had in the solar kiln. I put them over in the woodshed side for now. So once we're through all the 10-foot boards, I'll pull some of those back and continue on our way. So I finished stacking up the boards that I milled last night. To finish up this last row of 2x, I added in this older plank that has been in here drying for a couple months. This board was cut exactly the same as these two for width and thickness, same thickness as these. But you can see how much it has shrunk. It's a little harder to tell the width, but this is closer to probably about 5.5, where these are true 6. I was working through this log and there was a big branch that came off here that was broken off at some point, and I didn't realize that it was rotten down to the core, because when I cut down at the end's good and up there's good, but it's just right here in the middle. So I'll keep milling this. I'll probably end up having to cut out this section and just end up with some shorter boards on this side. This side will probably end up being firewood just because it's so short, there's no point. I'm really enjoying milling this birch. I haven't been able to do a lot of birch milling. I've only been able to do the spruce because I didn't have a way to move the birch. They're very heavy compared to the dry spruce. They're a bit more of a challenge because they're not nearly as uniform as the spruce. The spruce is very straight and doesn't really have very many curves or twists or anything like that to it. So it's pretty easy to hone in and get exactly the same result on every log. But these birch are a little bit more of a challenge because they do wave quite a bit. They've got bumps out on them. So it's a lot of tailoring to each individual log. I have been enjoying it though. These are turning out really nice. They smell a lot better than the spruce. The spruce, I mean, it smells like wood, whatever, but this birch, when you're cutting through the white, it doesn't really smell like much, but this center heartwood, exactly like apple cider. You start cutting through it and it smells just like apple cider. This one is quite the log. I had a hard time moving it with the skid steer, let alone trying to roll this thing around. I took a measurement and this short distance is 17 inches. And then the longest distance is 23. So this is a big log. Should give us a lot of lumber, but it is the one from earlier that had that seam that's just starting to rot here, but on the other side is about that big of a rot spot. So I've got to try and use my cant hook and twist this log so that that seam is up, and I'm gonna try and cut as much as I can of that off to salvage most of this. I have this side up a little bit more than that side just because the rot on this side is a bit worse than over there. So more of a priority to cut this off versus the real little bit down there, and I'm hoping somewhere in between it may be better yet. So we'll start with this. I'll just start doing slabs off the top until it looks like I can start working at the rest of it. This log's so big that it's higher than my measurement guide. I'm fighting for every board off of this rotten log, and in the middle of this cut, the sawmill stopped cutting. So taking a look here, and there's a keyhole there and there that should be lined up to spin this part. So if I spin my wheel, I'm not going to be able to spin it in this, I can't spin it because it's in the wood, but if I were to spin this wheel, only this part is spinning and the rod in the middle isn't, which means the motor is not spinning this wheel for me. So there's a key part that came out middle of the run, hit around in here somewhere, and is now somewhere. So until that's found, we're down. There it is. That's what we're looking for. Now I just got to get it out of this cut, line up my keyholes, and tap this back in with a hammer. Kind of an odd design. It doesn't have anything locking this in place. It just eventually vibrates out. This is the second time I've had this happen since owning a mill. Well, after it's all said and done, fighting for every board out of that log, even though it was so big, that rot vein in it just really ruined it. So I probably will not try and pursue any of those in the future. I did get one really wide 2x, and then I got a 2x3 there. 1, 2, 1 inch that are full length, and then just a whole bunch of random shorter stuff that just is not worth my time messing around with. I know I said I wouldn't try another log with rot in it at all, but I had this other log that was the top part of the first log I just did that still has that vein of rot. Instead of loading it up and moving it into the firewood pile, I wanted to try milling a little different direction. Typically I always do a flat saw or a standard cut, but there's also rift sawing and quarter sawing, and I haven't done any of that because that does limit the size of the lumber you get out of each log, so it seems like a waste. And being this log isn't going to produce anything for me really, I think it's a perfect one to practice on and see if I like the quarter sawn look. So just for a quick look at what I mean by this quarter sawn, I'll show you just the different ways here. Typically I would take and do a flat saw, which is just straight across like this, getting all my boards. Or I would do a plain saw or regular saw, which once you get around the heart here, you would turn it and cut and do these ones. So then you'd have your flat sawn basically on the top and bottom, and then down the center here I would turn it and go this way. And that's kind of your plain saw. Now what I want to try and do is a quarter saw, which what you would do with that is you would take, and we're going to take this into quarters, and then instead of doing our standard flat saw cuts like that, we're actually going to go and cut our boards out this way. So you can see obviously how that decreases the size of lumber I can get out of this log dramatically, but it should give me quite an interesting look. Some resources I've looked at show that quarter sawn would be cut into this way, and then you'd go and cut it like this. But that's kind of the same as doing your plain sawn. I don't think that's going to give me much of a different look. I'm going to go with this quarter sawn type. And then when you do a rift saw, which I'm not going to do because that gives you a lot of waste, is you take and you're going to take your board out here. So that's one board. But instead of doing another straight board off that, you're going to cut in straight to this heart again. So you're going to make this next board like this. So then this ends up being waste. Unless you have a bigger log, you can then do another one in here like this. And then you got waste, waste. So that would be a rift sawn, and I don't plan on doing that. Well, there it is. Half of it, at least. That is not something I'll ever consider doing again. It's a huge waste of time, waste of material, a lot of small pieces out of a log I should have got like easily 2x8s out of. I'm only getting real tiny stuff for the most part. And this wouldn't even be the finished product. I would still have to square all these up because they all have this one edge on it. So squaring it up besides makes them even smaller, so this is just a huge waste of material. Now I'm not too worried about it because this was a rotten log. All these pieces were fully rotten. There's not really anything I can salvage out of here. Maybe like 1 or 2 4-foot sections out of some of the small stuff. But it was a pretty good learning experience, and I can show you why people would want to do it this way. So this kind of like flame back and forth texture is why someone would want a quarter saw. Not this dark color, this is just part of the heartwood. But your grain structure, you can see, kind of flames through here. And that's a result of how we cut that. So we're cutting across our grain kind of at an angle, so it kind of waves and flames through there. On birch, it really isn't worth it because you don't really see the grain on the birch so much, except for in that heartwood. But on something like oak, where you really see that grain texture, doing this quarter sawn looks pretty neat. And just for a quick example of how I mill doing the flat sawn or plain sawn, you end up running with a grain texture something like this, where you see these waves going through it. And that's because we're getting into this heartwood that we're seeing. And then if I were to take the time and rift saw, which would cause even more waste, it would look something like this here, where you can see all the grain lines taking out this center pith. So from my fingers towards the end, that would be what your board would look like. I don't think there's a point to ever turn the mill on again. I'm never going to find a prettier board than these. Not really though, because I still have about half my pile to go. So it's not uncommon to have logs that have quite a bit of tension, especially on the outside if they're slightly curved or anything. So when you're cutting it, it'll bow up after the cut on the ends to relieve that tension, which may cause your main log to bow the other way. So you may have to flip it all the way around and do another just touch to straighten it back out. That is somewhat common. I run into it a bit, but this is definitely the first time I've ever cut a board that as soon as it came off, it just popped right in half. Quite a bit of tension in this one. The split down the middle was nearly straight on this slab, and after it finally broke off, it turned out to be very crooked. That was a lot of tension. So I realized I didn't explain exactly what I'm targeting with this birch. Mostly we want it for like trim and some cabinet work I'm going to be doing, and then shelves. So I'm getting 1x and 2x. The 2x will be for the shelves. It'll get planed down to like 1.5 inches after it dries and everything. And then the 1x's will turn into trim for the most part, and then the small pieces will be for cabinets. So how I'm determining what I'm getting out of a log is I square up my log by cutting the top off, turn it 90, cut it, and then just do that 2 more times to get a square beam. Then if it has quite a bit of a live edge to it, or if I cut it too high where it is really narrow, it becomes a 1x, because it's easy to work around the live edge stuff, cutting a narrower board out of it for the trim. And a lot of the cabinet work I'm going to be using shorter, smaller pieces so I can cut it to length and then square it up. After I take off some of those 1x's, the beam turns out really nice, and I can then get some nice 2x's out of it so I can make some nice shelves. That's not supposed to be nearly as hard to get on there. This wheel is supposed to loosen and tilt, and then you can kind of set it on there and spin it around. But I think this package of blades, I've just been having a terrible time with them, so putting that C-clamp on there to hold it on there seemed to work pretty good. And now I just need to tighten my handle, give it a couple turns, and then we should be good to go. Well, I was going to do one last log before I called it for this week, but after putting on my last layer, I realized I only have one 3-foot sticker board left. So I've got to mill up some sticker boards before I can continue on to my last log. Once we get that last log done, I'll be able to take the shorter boards I have set aside and get those stacked on top. we'll get everything strapped down nice and tight. So all we're going to do to make these sticker boards is I took a spruce log here that I typically would make into two 2x4s. I'm going to cut the top edge, flip it over, cut the other side, get it to 4 inches. Then I will turn it 90 degrees, get a squared edge, turn it 180, get a squared edge, so that I end up with a 4 by just whatever closest ½ inch. I'll zip it in half the 4-inch way, so I get 2 that are 2 by whatever the width happens to be, and then I'll zip them down in ½ inch strips. So the lowest I'm able to cut on the sawmill is 1.5 inches. Instead of getting the extra pair of stickers, I just leave it as a 2x2 in case I can use that for something in the future. But these stickers, I'm just gonna go cut them into 3-foot sections, and then every one of these will give me another layer. And there we go, that should get me through what I have already cut and the one I'm going to do. I was hoping I could use the sawmill to cut a nice slab off of this, but it's a little too big for the sawmill, so I think I'm going to use the chainsaw and cut a couple pieces off here, and then we'll mill up the rest of the log. This has a big hole here, obviously, and then a little bit on the bottom, so I don't think any of this will be like a good usable spot of this. So I'm thinking I might start with making a cut here down to the log, and then kind of take this and do a wedge here, and then after this is gone, lop off this chunk. I'm done, I'm calling it there. I still have this pile of birch, but they're mostly short or pretty skinny, where I just don't want to deal with them right now. They'll give me something to do in the winter months. Here's what we ended up with for 10-foot boards. The stack is about 4.5 feet tall and 3 foot wide and then 10 foot long. That's giving me about 1,250 board feet of birch. That's not including the shorter boards I still got to stack on here. So we'll get those stacked on here and we'll see what we have. Well, we got all the boards stacked, including the short ones. There's a few longer ones we kind of forgot about and had to fit in there with some posts to hold them up. So I'm gonna get some straps over these, and then I'm gonna have to try and figure out how to do this tarp. Well, it was a lot of work, but we ended up with a pile over my head. We have about 1,600 board feet here. This saves us a ton of money in the future. We're going to be making our shelves, trim, and cabinets out of this. If I were to go buy this in this state, it's usually about $3 a board foot, so we'd be looking at about $5,000 in this state. And then once this is all processed, I dry it and plane it and everything. The average in our area is around $6 a board foot, so that would be doubling up to about $10,000. Obviously, that's at like a retail store or anything, so buying in bulk or from a sawmill or anything, it would be cheaper than that, but it definitely saves us a lot of money either way.